Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to my friend and our next presenter, Dr. Tanner Edis, and allow me to share my screen so I can give a proper introduction. Now, Dr. Edis, his presentation today is on how Muslims bypass the problem of evil. Dr. Edis is professor of physics at Truman State University. His current research interests are in the history and philosophy of science, with special focus on paranormal and supernatural belief systems. His most recent book, Weirdness: What Fake Science and the Paranormal Tell Us About the Nature of Science, was just released this past November. I highly recommend getting the book. There's a link on the GCRR webpage for this conference to direct you directly to it. With that, Dr. Edis, thank you so much for doing this. You have the floor.
Okay, so I will share my screen. And okay, it looks like we're ready to go. Okay, so the first thing that you guys will notice from the screen is that I'm in a department of physics, and indeed the sign on my door says physics and weirdness. For a long time, I've been very interested in things which are really more fake science and the paranormal. But then you also notice that today's talk is on a topic that may seem entirely different. It's about how the problem of evil is perceived in Muslim cultural circumstance. This partially has to do with my personal background. I grew up in Turkey. Well, half my family is Turkish, half American. And even though I come from a fairly non-religious family, I didn't grow up with any sort of religion. A few of my relatives are Muslims. And so that's sort of my more default cultural background, not Christianity, but Islam. And when you approach things that way, you end up with an interesting perspective, let's say, because the problem of evil, of course, is one of the classic arguments that appear in the philosophy of religion. And clearly, I'm taking a view of the philosophy of religion from the outside. This is not typically my area of expertise. And indeed, as an outside observer, when I look at the kind of things that goes on in the philosophy of religion, I notice a lot of sort of very classic arguments that people have been going over for millennia. All the what's the logical proofs of God, the problem of evil, etc., so on and so forth. And again, from my perspective as a bit of an outsider, there's an interesting symmetry almost between the arguments that are presented by atheists and the arguments that are presented by theists, in that when theists make a big deal about the various classical proofs of God, atheists take up the sort of skeptical position, and they take the view that they want to deflate the various metaphysical intuitions about everything having a cause and so on and so forth. But then, if the non-believers go on the offensive, they are very likely to bring forth something like the classic problem of evil. And then we look at the religious responses. And very often what's happening is that their theists start deflating intuitions about the connections between divinity and suffering and so forth. And again, from an outsider's point of view, what you tend to see is that the philosophy of religion seems to be engaged in, is almost a permanent stalemate. Philosophers come up with variations on the classic arguments, depending on what side they take. And then their rivals debunk the details of that particular argument and go back to the drawing board. And we're seen to be in this perpetual stalemate cycle. And I'm going to make a suggestion today, perhaps, that one of the ways that might help us to move out of this permanent stalemate is to try and take some different perspectives from what has become the classic, very Christianity-influenced philosophy of religion. And I will suggest that maybe taking a look at philosophical perspectives that have developed in the long history of Islam will give us a fresh perspective on this matter. Because Islam has been around a long time. In many ways, it's a religion very similar to Christianity in fundamental theological details. But also, it's a religion that's different enough and has had a separate enough history that seeing a different perspective on a problem like the problem of evil might give us an occasion to sort of step back and evaluate the tradition of philosophy of religion a bit from the outside. So, one of the things I want to point out is that the whole enterprise of theodicy, of responding to critics who charge the religious tradition with perhaps even incoherence by basing it on issues like the problem of evil, this is actually not something that comes to the foreground in the tradition of Muslim philosophy. In fact, Muslim philosophy is typically, compared to the Christian version, is almost characterized by a kind of a refusal of engaging in theodicy. Let me point out a quotation here from Shabir Akhtar. And Akhtar is one of the actually very few philosophers in the analytic tradition who is also very much a conservative Muslim, fundamentalist in many ways. But he has a very interesting observation in one of his books, which is, among other things, an apologetics for Islam, is that he argues that Islamic thought does not concede as fundamental the problem of evil and the associated problem of the overwhelming amount of suffering it causes in a universe created and ruled by an omnipotent God. And he observes that no Muslim thinker or educated layman has identified theodicy as a project worthy of elaborate consideration. Now, this is a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, this is obviously just a two-sentence quote from a philosopher. And what really Akhtar is getting at is not so much that there's no such thing as theodicy in the history of Islamic philosophy. There's plenty of theodicy. In fact, just about anything that you can find in the Christian tradition, you can find some version reasonably close in the tradition of Muslim theology and philosophy. But what Akhtar is pointing out is that especially in the classical period of Islam, you do not have theodicy ever taking a central role as something that has worried Muslim thinkers. It really has not had the kind of degree of legitimacy even that it has had in a more Christian theological and philosophical tradition. And that observation is kind of interesting in this sense. Arguments we tend to consider to be credible or not, this credibility does not depend just on some sort of imaginary pureness of the logic in some sort of argument. There's a lot that we bring into any process of argumentation from our background intellectual culture. And if, say, for example, you're an atheist, a non-believer in a God, because you think that the problem of evil is a very potent objection to any possibility of a benevolent God running the show, it's quite possible that some of the background intellectual assumptions you're bringing into the argument have a lot to do with, say, you're growing up in a Christian religious environment, as opposed to, say, for example, a Muslim religious environment. So I think it's useful to focus a little bit more on what's happening with the Islamic example, just really to sort of step outside of our box. And one suggestion that Akhtar continues to make in his arguments is that much of what we see as atheism today, especially the kinds of atheism that emphasize the problem of evil, he suggests that this is a distinctly Christian form of atheism. And Akhtar suggests that the problem of evil is something that comes up largely due to the fusion of a very rather Christian preoccupation with salvation and atonement, which does not happen in the Muslim case, and the combination of that with Greek metaphysical notions of perfection, which is also something that tends to be downplayed in the Muslim metaphysical tradition. And in the Islamic case, of course, the history of early Islam shows plenty of evidence of absorbing Greek philosophy. Muslims also produced theodicies and things like that, especially in this early period. But the more mature classical intellectual culture that Islam produced, if we're talking about, say, 5, 6, 7 centuries ago, very little in this was any real motivation for doubt. So one suggestion of Akhtar is that problem of evil is really a Christian problem, not a Muslim problem. It's a bit exaggerated, as I said. Okay, so if we're looking at the Islamic case, we should probably start with the history of the Muslim approach to something like the problem of evil. And the first thing to look at, obviously, is the Quran, the source text, the sacred text of the Muslim religion. And the thing about the Quran, though, is, I mean, the Quran is a bit of a mess, if you're honest. And among other things, there is no such thing as a real coherent theology in the Quran. It's not really a text that encourages people with very sort of philosophical, metaphysical inclinations. I mean, it has many themes, the Quran, that plugs into the problem of evil. For example, the Quran has plenty of stories where one of the themes is the suffering of a righteous believer. But even though this righteous believer is suffering a lot of things, the believer also has a trust in God, and eventually that trust is rewarded, and often in unexpected ways. Another theme that's relevant from the Quran is the notion that good and evil, everything, comes from God. So there's little of the setting aside saying evils are actually generated by things like, I don't know, satanic forces, this, that, and the other. There are verses in the Quran which essentially say that evil comes from God as well as good. But also it's just a little bit self-contradictory. I mean, there are places in the Quran where it would basically say that good and evil all comes from God, and then switches to the next word and says the good that comes our way is due to the God, and evil is something that has to do with the corruption of the self. Another thing in the Quran that is relevant to the classic problem of evil is the notion of predestination. Who actually gets responsibility assigned for the various evil acts or suffering and so forth that we see in the world. So there are many verses in the Quran that would sort of gladden the heart of a Calvinist. It's very sort of predestinarian in many ways. So much to the extent that there are verses that say that, you get rewarded according to what you desire, but then people only desire as God wills. And verses that say things like, if God wanted, everybody would have been a believer and everybody would have gone to heaven, but obviously God did not will so for some unfathomable reason or something like that. But again, as I'm sort of hinting at over here with really only a few allusions, there's really no single view in the Quran, and it is a bit of a mess. So as a result, we really don't have any single dominant Muslim view throughout history about these things. The very mess nature, the very incoherent nature of the Quran can be very useful for a religious tradition because it invites interpretation. And so people, particularly intellectuals, come in and start reading the sacred texts and start reading what they want into the sacred texts, and then things start getting interesting. So what has happened in Muslim history is that interpretations of the text have often been shaped, as with any religious tradition, by a competition for religious authority. Now, the primary authority in most Muslim sects throughout history has been a kind of a rabbinical class. They're sort of analogous to the Jewish rabbis. There is kind of a scholarly class, and their job is to interpret the sacred texts, the Quran, and the traditions that follow the Quran. But they're also primarily lawyers. They are trying to derive religious rulings on what people should do. And sometimes, depending on the state structure and so forth, these rulings can have the force of actual law. And the rabbinical class in Islam has tended to a more literalist way of understanding texts. Again, for understandable reasons, because that's what they derive their authority from and so forth. But the scholarly class has not been the only authority in the history of Islam. They've had some competition. For example, very early on in the history of Islam, figures who were much more tied to the early Islamic empire's ruling class presented some competition. And this was a sort of an educated elite, including people who maintained the traditions and education that derived from Hellenistic philosophy. And their arguments, their way of appealing to authority depended much more on appeals to a kind of metaphysical form of reasoning, very often derived from really a continuation of Greek philosophy. And then, again, reasonably early in Muslim history, another source of authority started developing, which had much more to do with things like mystical experience. And this eventually flowered into the mystical tradition within Islam, where the authority of the teacher figures tended not to derive so much from their interpretation of texts and laws or their metaphysical prowess. It had much more to do with things like personal charisma, religious experience, magic, and things like that. And so what I'm trying to point out over here is that when we're talking about something rather specific like the problem of evil in the history of Islam, we should not think of this as sort of isolated philosophers gazing over the logic of arguments and things like that. These are not just intellectual debates over interpretation. In fact, the intellectual landscape, to a high degree, is shaped by really competition for religious authority between really different sources of authority. Okay, so one of the parties that is really important for our purposes is the early rationalists in Islam. And these are the people who, as I said, were tied to an educated elite who often held imperial offices. And one of the most important figures that are still remembered today by many Muslim intellectuals are people who are called the Mutazilites. They had a lot of imperial influence, and their main intellectual project was to integrate religion, this sort of new religion, this revelation of Islam, with the philosophical tradition that they inherited from pre-Islamic times. Their main themes were things like free will. They insisted that a proper God could not be given responsibility for any evil in the world. So any sort of evil that we saw around us, according to Mutazilites, had to trace back to sources like human free will. So they were very interested in projects, a very sort of Christian-like project of coming up with theodicies. Another interesting aspect of Mutazilite thought was that Mutazilites were very much against the rather casual anthropomorphisms that appear in the Quran that in describing God and so forth. Like if the Quran talks about the hand of God and things like that, Mutazilite reaction to that would be, no, that has to be metaphorical or something like that. And again, following a rationalist view, Mutazilites did the usual Muslim thing and accepted the Quran as direct divine speech with no human intermediary, but they also insisted that a Quran is secondary to the metaphysical reality of God, and therefore Quran is a created speech of God rather than something that was eternal. Now, the Mutazilites were perhaps the main faction among the rationalists, but they were not the only faction. And in this early history of philosophical approaches to the problem of evil, you can find some very interesting ideas that today's philosophers might appreciate as well. For example, the Maturidi faction came up with one of my really favorite strange arguments. And they argued that the evil that you saw in the universe actually was not so much a sign that there was no benevolent God in charge, but actually evil was a sign of a personal God being in charge. And the background of this argument is this. The main competition, philosophical competition to the more religious ways of thinking back then would have been more strictly rationalistic Hellenistic philosophical tradition, which had a tendency to make their gods less personal, and the creation of the material world and so forth would have been something that would have come about due to some rather impersonal necessity and things like that. But the Maturidis argued that the very imperfections, the horrible suffering and so forth that we saw in the world was actually a sign that it was not some sort of blind necessity that was creating the world, as in some more rationalist currents of thoughts, but it was a personal God who was in charge. So interesting argument. But what I want to point out is that alongside these early philosophers within the Muslim tradition, the Muslim tradition shows actually a fairly prominent skepticism about the whole philosophical enterprise as well. And we see signs of these fairly early on. For example, at the time of the Mutazilites, and again, remember, this is very early in the history of the Muslim empire, before it split apart into different empires, there was a faction called the Ash'arites. And the Ash'arites, even though they are philosophically can be actually quite sophisticated, their real base, their fan base, if you want, was more of the scholarly class rather than the more imperially based educated elites. And according to the Ash'arites, they actually rejected the whole Mutazilite approach to theodicy and everything. They argued that God was unconstrained by any sort of human moral standards. That it was in fact completely illegitimate to try and apply moral standards appropriate to humans to the divine realm. And in fact, they went ahead and said that the whole business of constructing theodicies, making excuses for God, was illegitimate. What the true believer had to do, according to the Ash'arites, is accept revelation, the Quran, as it is. And this included all of the anthropomorphisms and all these things that bothered the rationalists and led them to say, this doesn't make any sense. No, the idea of the Ash'arites was, you accept it just as it is. Because after all, are you sort of trying to match the critical abilities, the intellect of mere humans to, well, an infinite God, if you want. And they also took the position that they intensified the sacred nature of the Quran and said that the Quran was actually completely uncreated. So now, interestingly enough, what happened was, since the Mutazilites were tied to imperial authority, the Mutazilites actually decided to impose their particular understanding of religion onto the scholarly class, including the Ash'arites. And actually, the Inquisition that was formed and executed in Islamic history were associated with the Mutazilites. So the rationalists were the persecutors. And the whole episode is actually quite interesting because we tend to think sometimes that Christian history is particularly weird because people are getting really into violent conflicts over bizarre metaphysical issues like, I don't know, the nature of Christ and everything like that. Well, Muslims did much the same thing about the nature of the Quran. It actually turned into violent conflicts. Now, here's an interesting thing. The Ash'arites actually ended up the winners of this conflict. They are the forerunners of the Sunni orthodoxy of today. And the Sunni branch of Islam counts the allegiance of about maybe 90% of Muslims in the world today. So they ended up winning the religious battle. And indeed, in the centuries after the Mutazilites and the Ash'arites and their quarrels, there was an increasing crystallization of orthodoxy in Sunni Islam and the empires that enforced Sunni Islam. A very important figure of those days is philosopher, theologian, lawyer, who is still remembered among Orthodox Muslims today as one of the greatest. It's maybe kind of what you might think of as the equivalent of Thomas Aquinas is for Catholicism, Al-Ghazali is for Sunni Islam. And one of the important works of Al-Ghazali is something called the Incoherence of the Philosophers, which is a sort of a broad attack on the philosophy of his day. And what Ghazali presented was a view in which religion, and a very orthodox form of religion at that, would condition intellectual life at all levels. And even though Ghazali was a pretty good philosopher himself, his interest was to sort of force philosophy down in the intellectual pecking order. Now, as far as the problem of evil is concerned, Ghazali himself did a little bit of theodicy. He made arguments such as that apparent flaws in creation are actually something that serve the greater glory. But that's not really one of the reasons why we remember Al-Ghazali today. His theodicy was almost sort of superficial. What he ended up doing was to say that, in his arguments, ended up saying that the revelation, the Quran in the Muslim case, is primary, and the best way to actually advance in religious knowledge and so forth was not so much scholarly work, is not so much dealing with metaphysics as mystical experience. So again, here's a sort of a similarity to Aquinas and so forth, if you want. He ended up his career really going after Sufi mystical experience and set his philosophy aside. Now, the thing that's important for us is that the scholarly class, the main source of religious knowledge to this day among Muslims, has followed the Ash'arites first, and then Ghazali second, and that tradition, which put revelation and sometimes mystical experience first and foremost, that has conditioned the bulk of the Muslim approach to things like the problem of evil. This has institutionalized itself in things like the madrasa education that most Muslim scholars have had now for many, many centuries. And in classic Islam, in the classical period of Islam, what happened was that when scholars were doing things like, say, cataloging the various forms of knowledge, religious forms of knowledge ended up at the top. Philosophy was sort of considered more of a foreign science, lower in the pecking order. And even even theology, because of its historical connection to philosophy, is actually downgraded in the Muslim understanding of knowledge. So that's actually quite an important difference with the Christian case, which tends to elevate theology to the queen of the sciences. Muslims never did anything like that. Now then, this does not mean, of course, that suffering in the world goes away, and it does not mean that religious responses to suffering are not important. They remain very important in the Muslim intellectual tradition. But what Muslims ended up doing is kind of...
One last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.